On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military strike on Iran that killed the supreme leader Ali Khamenei and targeted the country's most senior military commanders, nuclear scientists, and government infrastructure. The world held its breath. And within hours, Iran's response came, not from its president, not from its foreign minister, but from a man most people outside of intelligence circles had never heard of. A general who had spent 4 decades building terror networks, overseeing brutal crackdowns and dodging an Interpol. Red Notice. His name is Ahmad Vahidi, and as of March 2026, he is the commander-in-chief of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. He is also, according to almost every major analyst watching the conflict, the man who is actually running Iran right now, and he has done something that Washington did not expect. He crossed every line they had drawn, one by one, and dared America to respond. This is not the Iran story you think you know. Because what is happening right now inside Tehran's power structure is so shocking, so unprecedented, and so dangerous that even veteran Middle East analysts are struggling to find historical comparisons. And Washington's response has been the kind of swift escalatory countermove that signals just how seriously they are taking what Vahidi has been doing. Stay right here, because what comes next will change how you understand this entire war. Before we talk about what Vahidi did to cross the line, you need to understand who this man actually is, because his background tells you everything about his intentions. Born in 1958 in Shiraz, Ahmad Vahidi joined the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in 1980, just 1 year after the revolution. By 1983, he was already embedded in the Quds Force, the IRGC's elite overseas operations unit that specializes in unconventional warfare, foreign proxy training, and covert assassination. By 1988, at just 30 years old, he was its commander. He held that position until 1997, spending nearly a decade building what would become Iran's most powerful foreign policy instrument, a shadow army of proxy groups stretching from Lebanon to Iraq to Yemen. He is the man who helped build Hezbollah into the dominant military force in Lebanon. Under his leadership, the Quds Force trained thousands of Hezbollah fighters, supplied them with weapons, and transformed a militia into something resembling a state within a state. He is also accused by Argentine prosecutors of being directly involved in planning the 1994 bombing of the EMI, a Jewish community center in Buenos Aires, an attack that killed 85 people and remains the deadliest terror attack in Latin American history. Argentina issued an Interpol red notice for his arrest. He has been under U.S. sanctions since 2010 for his role in Iran's nuclear and missile programs. The European Union added its own sanctions layer on top of that. Despite all of it, he served as Iran's defense minister from 2009 to 2013 under President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. He later became interior minister, where he oversaw Iran's security forces during the brutal crackdown on women's rights protests following the death of Mahsa Amini in 2022. He publicly described pressure on Iran's mandatory hijab laws as, in his own words, a colonial plot. The protests, the largest in the Islamic Republic's history, were crushed with lethal force on his watch. This is the man who is now running Iran's military, its diplomatic strategy, and increasingly, its government itself. And if that is already shocking enough for you, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because what he has done since taking command is going to make everything else you just heard seem like a prelude. When the war began on February 28, 2026, the chain of command at the top of the Iranian government fractured almost immediately. Ali Khamenei was dead. His son, Mojtaba Khamenei, elevated to supreme leader in the chaos that followed, had not been seen publicly since Israeli and U.S. strikes reportedly hit his residence on the same day. Iran's president, Masoud Pezeshkian, and foreign minister Abbas Araghchi were still nominally in their positions, but something had changed beneath the surface, according to detailed reporting from the Wall Street Journal and assessments published by the Institute for the Study of War. Vahidi and his inner circle had, within weeks of the war's outbreak, secured control over not only Iran's military response, but also its negotiating position with the United States, a function that has historically been reserved for political leaders, diplomats, and elected officials, had been seized by a general whose public presence is almost non-existent, and whose last confirmed photograph is weeks old. Araghchi told the press on April 17th that the Strait of Hormuz was completely open to commercial traffic. The very next day, April 18th, the IRGC Navy attacked several commercial vessels and declared that no vessel of any type or nationality was permitted passage through the strait. Not some vessels, not military vessels, all of them. The reversal happened overnight, and IRGC-affiliated media announced simultaneously that Iran had withdrawn from the next round of negotiations with the United States due to what they called excessive American demands. A diplomat made a public promise. A general canceled it the next morning, and the general won. The Institute for the Study of War's assessment was stark. Vahidi and his inner circle had consolidated control over Iran's negotiating strategy in a way that is almost unprecedented in the history of the Islamic Republic. The IRGC, an organization built to fight wars and run proxy networks, was now running the country's foreign policy. This is not normal. This is the kind of structural shift inside a government that typically precedes either a very dangerous military escalation or a very desperate gamble. Smash that like button and subscribe if you want to understand how Washington read that shift and what they decided to do about it. Let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz, because that is where Vahidi's most consequential crossing of the line has taken place. The strait is a narrow waterway between Iran and Oman, only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, through which roughly a third of the world's seaborne oil travels. If you have a car, a home heated by gas, or food that was transported by a vehicle, the Strait of Hormuz affects your life every single day. Closing it is not just a military move, it is a weapon aimed directly at the global economy. After the war began, Iran blocked the strait, and the effect was immediate. The largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Flights in and out of the Middle East came to a near complete stop. Dubai International Airport, one of the busiest in the world, was damaged by drone strikes and temporarily halted all operations. Shipping costs exploded. Oil tankers with a combined cargo of 35 million barrels were stuck in the Persian Gulf, unable to move. Countries that had built their entire energy import strategies around the assumption that the strait would remain open were suddenly staring at an impossible problem. And at the center of it all was Vahidi, who controls the IRGC Navy, the small boat fleet, and the anti-ship missile systems that make the strait so dangerous to cross without Iran's permission. He instituted a toll system for vessels wanting to pass, selecting which countries got free passage and which had to pay. Russia was exempted. India was negotiated with bilaterally. Countries aligned with the West were charged. The message was clear. Iran, under Vahidi, was using the strait not just as a wartime choke point, but as a permanent lever of economic sovereignty, something the Islamic Republic had always claimed but never actually enforced at this scale. When the United States announced a naval blockade of Iranian ports in April, requiring all ships headed to or from Iran to be inspected, Vahidi's response was to reclose the strait entirely and attack commercial vessels again. The IRGC seized 2 container ships and fired on a third. They shot down a U.S. MQ-1 Predator drone, claiming it was over Iranian territorial waters. U.S. Central Command confirmed the drone was shot down, but said it was operating over international waters. Within hours, CENTCOM launched defensive strikes on Keshem Island and in Gorak Province, targeting Iranian air defense systems, a ground control station, and 2 attack drones. Iran retaliated by firing 2 ballistic missiles at U.S. forces in Kuwait. Both were intercepted. That exchange happened in the space of less than 48 hours. A drone gets shot down. America strikes back within hours. Iran fires missiles within hours of that. The speed of escalation in this conflict is unlike anything we have seen in decades of U.S.-Iran tension. And if you thought the strait situation was already beyond dangerous, you need to hear what Vahidi has been doing inside Iran's own decision-making structure. Like and subscribe right now, because the next part explains why Washington is more worried about this general than any Iranian president they have ever dealt with. According to the Times of Israel and the Wall Street Journal, Vahidi has not just taken control of Iran's military and diplomatic strategy. He has blocked the Iranian president from appointing his own intelligence minister. Every candidate put forward by Pezeshkian was rejected by Vahidi. He has insisted that during wartime, all critical and sensitive leadership positions must be decided by the IRGC. He attempted to insert a loyalist agent into Iran's own negotiating team during the Islamabad talks, despite protests from both Ghalibaf and Araghchi over the man's total lack of diplomatic experience. When the delegation returned to Tehran after those talks without a deal, Araghchi and Ghalibaf faced sharp public criticism from hardliners who accused them of offering too many concessions. Vahidi's camp was behind that criticism. A regional official with direct knowledge of the mediation process told the Associated Press that Vahidi has become the main point of contact for those negotiating with Iran, replacing the elected political officials who normally hold that role. The Wall Street Journal found that he has frequently overruled the president and foreign minister, and in each instance of disagreement, the IRGC commander has come out on top. A military general, wanted by Interpol under US and EU sanctions, who has not been seen publicly in months, is making the decisions that are determining whether the United States and Iran go back to war or manage to find an exit from this conflict. In paramilitary, the line between an organization that enforces policy and one that makes it. And Washington's response came within hours of each crossing. When the IRGC attacked commercial vessels and halted strait traffic in April, CENTCOM responded the same day with strikes on Iranian air defense positions. When Iran launched missiles at Kuwait, The U.S. intercepted them and issued a direct warning. When Vahidi's camp suspended negotiations, the United States announced an open-ended blockade extension, and Trump threatened additional strikes on Iranian power plants and bridges. When Iran's IRGC-affiliated media tried to claim a fraudulent act of sovereignty over the strait by broadcasting fabricated alerts about foreign ships, the U.S. publicly called it out within hours and released maritime tracking data proving the ship in question was linked to the Iranian regime itself. Each crossing, each response, within hours. This is no longer a slow-moving diplomatic standoff. This is a real-time confrontation between the most powerful military on Earth and a general who has built his entire career on the belief that Iran can survive any amount of external pressure as long as it refuses to show weakness. But there is something Vahidi may be miscalculating. His grip on power inside Iran is real, but it is also fragile in ways that he cannot publicly acknowledge. According to a government poll conducted in June 2026, nearly 60% of Iranians said they were financially unable to continue with their daily lives. 70% demanded government changes. A Reuters survey found that only about a quarter of Americans thought the war had been worth it, which creates political pressure on Trump to find an exit. Both sides, in other words, have internal audiences that want this to end, even as the man actually controlling Iran's decisions is the one most invested in it continuing. Because Vahidi's power depends on the war. Without it, he is just a general, wanted by Interpol, operating in a country that was already economically struggling before the first bomb fell in February. With it, he is the indispensable man, the only figure who controls both the missiles and the strait and the negotiations, the man who cannot be bypassed because no deal can be implemented without his consent, and no ceasefire can hold without his order. Washington knows this. The reason responses have been arriving within hours is not just operational readiness. It is a deliberate signaling strategy. Every CENTCOM strike, every blockade enforcement, every public statement calling out Iranian deception is a message directed not to Pezeshkian or Araghchi or even Mojtaba Khamenei. It is directed at Vahidi. It says, we know who is making the decisions, and we know where to find what you depend on. The strikes on Qeshm Island hit air defense assets the IRGC controls. The blockade enforcement affects the revenue flows the IRGC depends on. The continued military presence in the Gulf is a permanent reminder that the IRGC's small boat advantage in the Strait is meaningful only up to the point where it isn't. Former CENTCOM commander Joseph Votel said in a May 2026 NPR interview that the two sides were still at extreme ends of their negotiating positions, and that fundamental trust would have to be built before any real movement toward a deal was possible. He also noted that Iran is, in his words, a survivor, a country that endured an 8-year war with Iraq under devastating conditions, and came out the other side believing that suffering in the short term is worth strategic survival in the long run. Vahidi is the living embodiment of that ideology. He has spent his entire adult life, 46 years, inside the IRGC. The only world he knows is one where Iran fights, endures, and eventually outlasts its enemies. In 2026, when the IRGC's missile facilities have been destroyed, its strait revenues depend on a ceasefire holding. 60% of the Iranian population is saying publicly that they cannot survive this financially. And the one man keeping the hardline position in place is an Interpol fugitive who hasn't been photographed in public in months. If you want to understand how this war ends, you have to understand Ahmad Vahidi. Because as long as he is the one making the decisions in Tehran, no deal is done until he says it is done. And based on everything we have seen in 2026, he does not cross lines. He erases them. And Washington has been responding every single time within hours. Smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. Because this story is moving faster than any war in recent memory, and we will be here every step of the way, breaking it down in a way that actually makes sense. Let's go back to the beginning of the war itself, because to understand why Vahidi's line crossing matters so much, you have to understand the scale of what the US and Israel actually did on February 28, 2026, and what it created inside Iran. The operation was codenamed Epic Fury by the United States. It involved B-2 stealth bombers, the most advanced aircraft in the American arsenal, deploying massive ordnance penetrator bombs, the largest conventional weapons in the U.S. inventory, specifically designed to destroy underground bunkers. 14 of these bombs were dropped in a single operation. Iranian military sites, government facilities, nuclear infrastructure, and the residences of senior leadership were all struck simultaneously. Senior IRGC commanders and nuclear scientists were killed. The supreme leader himself was killed. And in the immediate chaos that followed, Iran did something it had never done in the history of the Islamic Republic. It lost the top of its own power structure in a single night. What emerged in the weeks after was not a weakened Iran looking for the exit. It was a restructured Iran, with the IRGC filling the vacuum that had been created, and Vahidi stepping into a role that no IRGC commander had ever held before, not just military chief, but effective head of state. The cost in American taxpayer money, as of mid-June 2026, was estimated at $113 billion. The global economic damage from the closure of the Strait of Hormuz represented the largest oil supply disruption in recorded history. Brent crude prices spiked, then partially stabilized, as Omani corridor routes were opened, but the underlying instability remained. Around 80 naval mines were estimated to still be present in the central traffic separation scheme of the strait, making a full return to normal shipping impossible until they were cleared. Iran's own economic situation has been catastrophic throughout this period. A government poll from late June 2026 showed that nearly 60% of Iranians reported being financially unable to continue their daily lives. 70% demanded government changes. UN sanctions reimposed in September 2025 had already caused the Iranian currency to collapse before the war even started. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent had described that collapse as the grand culmination of Washington's economic pressure strategy. Then, the war made everything worse. The oil revenues that had kept the IRGC funded and the regime afloat were now being disrupted by the very blockade and maritime confrontations that Vahidi was orchestrating. And yet Vahidi pushed ahead, because the paradox of his position is that the IRGC's leverage, its ability to block the strait, its control over Iran's missile arsenals, its authority over frozen assets, is most valuable during the war. The moment a deal is signed, that leverage evaporates. And Vahidi, who spent 40 years accumulating exactly this kind of power, is not going to surrender it to a diplomatic agreement that removes the one thing making the IRGC indispensable. This is why Washington has been responding not just militarily, but legally and financially. U.S. sanctions on Vahidi himself date back to 2010. The EU added its own. Argentina's Interpol Red Notice for the AMIA bombing has never been lifted, and when he was appointed IRGC commander in March 2026, the Argentine government specifically reaffirmed that the notice remained in place. The United States has made it publicly clear that any final deal on Iran's nuclear program in the Strait will require conditions that Vahidi, based on his entire public record, finds ideologically unacceptable. Full dismantling of nuclear enrichment, no Iranian control over Strait revenues, no recognition of IRGC sovereignty over Gulf shipping lanes. These are the American red lines, and Vahidi's red lines run in exactly the opposite direction. He wants Iran to retain enrichment capability. He wants the IRGC to keep collecting tolls in the Strait. He wants the frozen $24 billion in Iranian financial assets unfrozen and available for, according to reporting from the New York Times, military spending. President J.D. Vance has a major achievement. He said the opening of the Strait of Hormuz and the ending of the Iranian nuclear program had already been accomplished. But Iran's side told a different story. Iran's chief negotiator Ghalibaf argued publicly that Iran would continue to collect fees from Strait transiting vessels, framing the MOU as something that acknowledged Iranian economic interests in the waterway. 60 of 88. Assembly of Experts members issued a warning to Iran's own negotiating delegation that they must not cross the supreme leader's red lines. Hardline IRGC elements in IRGC-affiliated media were openly critical of the deal. And by July 2nd, Iran announced that IAEA inspectors would not be permitted entry to the Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan nuclear sites, citing a law passed by the Iranian parliament. Iran also warned oil tankers on July 2nd to take permitted routes through the Hormuz, or risk a forceful response. This is what crossed lines look like when the man crossing them is not a politician facing elections, but a general who has survived every crackdown, every sanctions regime, every American military threat since 1980. And this is what Washington's response looks like when they have finally accepted that the person they are dealing with is not the president of Iran or its foreign minister, but a figure who has spent his entire life making himself impossible to bypass. Whether or not a final agreement holds, whether or not the ceasefire survives, and whether or not Vahidi's own grip on power remains stable in a country where 60% of people say they cannot continue financially, the 2026 Iran war has revealed something that should matter to everyone watching. When a country loses its top leadership overnight, the thing that fills the vacuum is whatever organization has the guns, the missiles, the money, and the institutional loyalty built over decades. In Iran's case, that is the IRGC. And in 2026, that means it is Ahmad Vahidi, a general wanted by Interpol, unseen in public for months, running a war, crossing lines, and watching Washington respond every single time within hours.